As I said, I like to organise traditional Remembrance Day service. But I hope I don't give you the same service every year. Last year I talked about battle fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. And today I want to talk about another feature of war, and that is the loneliness of the serviceman, soldier, sailor, or whatever. There are the obvious dangers of battle: bomb, bullet, and bombardment. It may interest you to know that during the Great War, it wasn't bullets that killed and maimed the largest number of combatants. It was actually the big guns, the shells. The constant shelling. The hundreds of thousands of tons of big shells that fell into the mud of Flanders, and which still claim lives today as farmers find unexploded ordnance still coming to the surface in their fields. And they put them to one side, they put them in the ditch. And there are teams of soldiers from bomb disposal units that come and make them safe. But not all of them. Sometimes, even after over 100 years, they go off. Britain has fought many foreign wars. In fact, the last war fought on British soil was the English Civil War, back in the 1640s, 1650s. Since the early part of the 18th century, all of Britain's wars have been fought abroad. Soldiers have gone abroad. And of course, up until modern times, there was no way that a soldier could come home for a leave. There might be away from family and home for years. Consider the Great War. British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, fought in France. That's not very far, especially as it was northern France, and there's a corner of Belgium. It's not very far from Britain. But the soldiers, of course, once they'd done their often very basic training in Britain, went over the Channel and went in the trenches. And they remained in northern France until they were maimed, or they were died, or the war ended. You may have heard the term a blighty one, a wound that would get you sent back to Britain. It had to be a very serious wound to get you sent back to Britain. And it probably meant that you wouldn't be going back to service. Soldiers and their families had to rely on letters. Letters that were often delayed. The soldier away from his family would look forward to receiving a letter, of course. But the letters from England, from Britain, into northern France were often very, very delayed. The letters from the trenches back to home, of course, would be delayed as well. Letters could end up chasing a soldier around the battlefield. Amidst their mates, and they had mates, their comrades in arms, men were still very lonely, very worried about their families, and of course their families were very worried about them. People learned to dread the arrival of a telegram, because so many of those telegrams told a family that a husband, a brother, a son was missing, and missing often meant dead. No television, no radio, no internet. People turned to newspapers, and every day in the newspaper there would be a column finished in a heavy black line, the list of those killed in action. And sometimes that was the way that families found out that their loved ones were dead. In the Second World War, the majority of the BEF made it back to Britain, and they served in Britain, the army, for many years, didn't they? Until 1944, when they went back into France. And those who went into France from D-Day onwards didn't get leave to come back to Britain. Airmen, of course, for most of the war, did serve in Britain. But we should remember that the RAF suffered the greatest casualties compared to the number of men in the service of any of the three services. Sailors, of course, once you went aboard your ship and your ship left Britain, you wouldn't see friendly shores again for months, possibly years. A lot of ships were refitted in the United States and Canada. And think of those soldiers that were sent out to the Far East to fight the Japanese. You couldn't just hop back home, could you? Like the sailor who wanted leave, who would have to have a very long swim. My Uncle Fred joined the Seaforth Highlanders in 1939. And from 1939 to 1941, the Seaforth Highlanders served in Britain. They weren't part of the BEF. 1941, his battalion was sent out to the Far East to serve in the Burma campaign. He didn't come home for 4 years. 4 years in the jungle, fighting a brutal enemy. Like so many of those men that were sent out to the Far East, he never wanted to talk about his experiences. He did so reluctantly and only very rarely. I remember him talking about it only a couple of times he told us about the landmine. He, a sergeant by then, was leading a column of vehicles into camp in the jungle. They were following a dirt road. As I say, he was leading in a Bren gun carrier. Approaching the camp, somebody behind him got impatient. And a truck swept past his Bren carrier to get into camp early and hit a mine. As he said, if that hadn't happened, that would have been him. And everybody in the truck was killed, of course. On another occasion, Uncle Fred had seen an astrologer. He didn't believe in astrology. He said as much. But he'd seen an astrologer. It was the sort of thing that men did when they got their limited leaves. This would have been in northern India. And he said, she told me I would get back home. And, of course, no astrologer, once he gets paid, is going to tell a soldier he's going to stop a bullet, is it? No, that's just not going to happen. And I think my Uncle Fred knew that. But there was one occasion a little while later when Japanese aircraft strafed their camp, and Uncle Fred ended up hiding underneath a truck as the bullets spanned into the ground close by, and he found himself repeating, she said I'd get home. She said I'd get home. Of course, out in Burma, letters were few and far between. It was a long way. Newspapers were always out of date. But they did have ENSA, the entertainers, who brought a little bit of cheer. ENSA. Every night something awful. It's not the same as going home. Modern conflicts. Korea, Malaya, Iraq, Afghanistan. What was overseas? What was a long way from home? As time went on, by the time we get to the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, there are better means of communication. Back in camp, you could watch television. Back in camp, there were emails, and you might get a signal for your mobile phone as well. The chance to hear a familiar voice from home. But it's still not the same. It's still not the same as being in your own home with your loved ones. Being able to watch your children growing up. In the present day, I never imagined we'd see war in Europe again. And yet we do. I think back to 1960s, late 1960s. I was with my father in France, and we were visiting some quite out of the way monument or other, I can't remember what it was, somewhere in the south of France. And there was a crowd of young men about. They looked like hippie types. And my father looked at them and said, "Réfractaire." It does have an English translation, refractories, but actually it was a word coined in the time of Napoleon, who introduced the first conscription in France. And it really translates as draft dodger, réfractaire, and he was very bitter about that. These young men had refused to serve their country. I didn't really understand then, but I came to understand later. These weren't conscientious objectors. France was not at war. They weren't going to be asked to go into trenches or anything like that. At that time, we were 69, I think, it was fashionable to reject all the experiences of your elders, not relevant. But as I say, there is war in Europe again. And British citizens, no matter what their original country of origin, could be called up again. The Defence of the Realm Act that stopped, that was conscription, that stopped in the 50s. In France it went on to the year 2000. But young men and women these days could be called up. Will they be willing to serve for king and country? Well, I don't think there'll be any more keen to serve for king and country than the soldiers of the Great War, who didn't volunteer, or who weren't conscripted and went, because they had an ideal of patriotism in that form. They went to do what was necessary, as they did in the Second World War, as they did in Korea and Malaya, which were conscripts. I think, I hope, I pray, that young people will be as willing in the future to stand up and be counted as previous generations. But I fear the toll of dead and wounded will be even greater.